Today, in the third and final video of this series, we're talking about privacy and autonomy. We already encountered this a little way back in the first video when we talked about different definitions of privacy, and in particular the US Supreme Court's version of constitutional privacy as the ability to make important life decisions without undue interference. Remember this? Like in Whelan v. Roe, where the Supreme Court made it clear that there's information privacy on the one hand, and then there's decision-making privacy on the other, but both are a part of their concept of privacy as a whole. Remember also that I mentioned how philosophers and legal scholars are still debating this issue to this day? So they're still debating whether or not a good, solid, robust definition of privacy should only be about personal information, or if it should be about both personal information and other things like this sort of decisional non-interference. And then in the previous video, we completely ignored this problem by only focusing on informational privacy instead. However, I think this is really important stuff, this question of how privacy and autonomy, understood as our ability to make independent decisions, how these two relate to each other. So in this video, that's what I'll be talking about. And just to summarize and be as clear as possible right from the start, here's my view on it. I believe that privacy and autonomy are probably separate concepts, and so I can completely understand the scholars who criticize the US Supreme Court's idea of constitutional decision-making privacy. But what I think many of these critics get wrong is just how intricately privacy and autonomy interact with each other. So separate concepts, yeah, sure, but ones that still have a huge impact on each other. Why? Well, basically because the more privacy you lose, the more your autonomy is threatened. And this is true not just in the blackmail sense, that if other people know your dirty secrets, then they can force you to do something by threatening to reveal those secrets. No, for most of us, that's not usually a relevant part of our lives. Instead, for most of us, the way that privacy and autonomy relate are all in relation to things like big data information processing and similar. That is, the more information that's available about us, the more our behavior can be, well, manipulated. And obviously, the more manipulated we are, the less autonomy we have. So that's what I'll be arguing here today. In order to start off the argument, we're going to have a quick look at the brain. Ah, the human brain, so fascinating and mysterious. Although I have to say, fact is that the human brain is, well, pretty easy to fool in all sorts of ways. We kind of talked a bit about this in the previous video when I mentioned how cognitive bandwidth puts a limit on realistic uses of passwords and data security protocols and so on. Basically, that we humans tend to be quite dumb with all sorts of things because of our brain's limited processing power. But sometimes it's not just that we're dumb and that with a little effort we could be better if we'd only try just a little bit harder. No, sometimes it's down to the way our brains are hardwired, and no matter how hard we try, we'll never be able to get around the limitations. Let me give you a few examples. First, here are two lines. Which one's longer? The one on the bottom? Nope, sorry. They're both exactly the same length. But the way our brains process visual inputs and try to force a little 3D perspective onto flat 2D images makes it seem otherwise. Want another one? Okay, how about this picture? Do you see black circles where some of the lines intersect? Well, there are none there. In fact, there are only blank spaces in each intersection. But again, because of the way our brain processes visual inputs, it, so to say, fills in the gaps and makes it look like there are circles. White circles at the point you're fixating on, and black circles at the intersections that are more peripheral to your focus point. Alright, now how about this one? Would you believe it if I told you that A and B are the exact same shade of gray? No? Well, they are. The reason our brain doesn't see this is, well, again, because it tends to make certain hardwired assumptions about the nature of 3D objects, in this case involving shading. And it's not just 3D elements either. As fans of the Italian Renaissance painter Arcimboldo have long known, our brains have an uncanny ability to see faces in stuff that isn't necessarily a face, like a few squiggles, or bowling balls, or graters, or rocks on Mars. Is this proof of animism, of the spirit that resides in inanimate objects, or maybe even of aliens? No. It's more like proof of an overactive fusiform face area, a region of the brain specialized in processing faces. Why are our brains like this? Well, it's pretty simple. Humans are an intensely social species, and our survival in the past would have depended on how others in our tribe related to us. If they liked us or disliked us, if they were happy with us or angry with us, if they were trying to gain our affection or plot our assassination. So being able to recognize and read faces and all the social and emotional information they convey, yeah, pretty crucial. And no, in case you're wondering, these aren't effects that you can train away, even after you're aware of them. You can't look at an Archimboldo and not see a guy there. In fact, the only way to train them away would be to destroy part of the fusiform face area, and that's definitely not advisable. And it's not just things we see either. For instance, it's quite easy to manipulate emotions. Want to increase the chance that your wallet gets returned if you lose it somewhere in public? Well, just put a cute photo of a baby inside. It doesn't matter who the baby is, even a stock photo off the internet will work just fine. But studies have shown that if whoever finds the wallet and opens it up encounters those big eyes and cute cheeks, well, it disarms them, and they are then much more likely to hand the wallet in to the lost and found, or the police, or whoever. Or maybe you want to intimidate others, make them respect you more. Well, then just speak louder and with a deeper voice, and you're good to go. People will spontaneously and intuitively be more likely to do as you say. So the question is, how far can we stretch this? Can we use subliminal messaging to get people to buy whatever products we want them to? Or turn a person into some sort of sleeper agent who will do crazy things that they have no control over the moment we utter the key words? Or perhaps we can hypnotize masses of people to do our bidding like some form of total mind control. Well, no. I'm happy to say that none of these actually work in real life. So no worries, nobody else is ever going to take complete control over your mind and behavior. But that doesn't mean we can't be manipulated, because we most certainly can. Sometimes this is probably a good thing, like when a public health organization comes up with some silly song to remind people to wash their hands.
Rub the palms, 1, 2. Rub the knuckles, 1, 2. Rub the insides of your fingers and the back of them too.
Now, this won't brainwash people into washing their hands against their will, but if it's done the right way, it certainly can increase the likelihood that they'll wash their hands, thereby raising the aggregate frequency of hand washing in the population as a whole. Other times things get ethically trickier. And that, my friends, is the concern here. How the incidental discovery of various brain quirks, along with different ways to hack them, significantly increases the risk of manipulation. And as the amount of personal information collected and aggregated in a single place goes up, so too does the risk of ever more effective and efficient manipulation. Ready? Let's get started. Big data. You've all heard of it, although you might only have a vague idea of what it is. And, well, it can mean slightly different things in different contexts, but let's stick with a general understanding for now. On this view, big data just means that we have enormous amounts of data, too much to approach in a traditional data processing way, and so we need to use alternative and more sophisticated methods. These will tend to rely on machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence and whatnot. The exact steps differ a lot from one case to another, but generally we're talking about having so much information that it would be difficult for any human to even begin processing or making sense of or finding patterns within it, and so we rely on computers to do the heavy lifting for us. Now, the idea of using data in this way isn't new. A classic example is Moneyball. Yes, the thing they made a movie about with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, or who haven't seen the film, the basic idea is just this. American Major League Baseball teams have, like any other elite sport, a high turnover of players. As the players age and their physical potential declines over time, they need to be replaced by new, fresh talent. So therefore, a huge part of building a winning strategy is to find the right sort of talent among younger, up-and-coming players, like from within college or minor league baseball. And this is what baseball scouts are employed to do. To find the best talent for their team and recruit them with impressive offers. And to a certain extent, it worked, right? Talent scouts would look at certain statistics, like a player's batting average and stolen bases and so on, and combine this with their own subjective expertise built up and honed over the years to select those players they deemed most likely to benefit their team. But then, in the early 2000s, the Oakland Athletics changed everything. Basically, the A's were a decent but not great major league team with limited funding. In other words, they couldn't compete with the offers made by talent scouts from bigger and richer teams like the New York Yankees. However, instead of recruiting new talent on the basis of more traditional measures like batting average, they focused on lesser-known statistics like how frequently hitters would make it to base. In a nutshell, you could say they engineered an approach to baseball statistics not on the basis of common sense or of tried-and-true expertise, but rather by taking a more neutral and data-led approach. Some stats, like on-base percentage, happen to relate more closely to successes than the ones we naturally assume ought to, like batting average. Then we just ignore the ones that make sense to our brain's way of looking at it and instead focus on those that the data suggest we ought to focus on. Perhaps it doesn't make much sense, but boy does it pay off. In 2006, for instance, the A's were ranked 5th in the major league despite coming 24th of 30th in terms of the size of their budget, all thanks to taking more of a big data approach. So what is it that characterizes the big data approach in this sort of context? Well, first off, you have loads of data. As I said a few minutes ago, more data than any human is ever going to be likely to figure out completely or see all the possible patterns within. Then you apply different algorithms to help you sort through the data in order to highlight interesting patterns in relation to certain inputs and outcomes. Basically, by defining the good and the bad outcomes, your algorithm will tell you which input or combination of inputs most clearly correlates with them. And not only that, as you keep feeding more and more data into your system, then there's a good chance that any correlation you find will correct and improve over time, and so become increasingly predictive. And the value of this is huge. It's no wonder that most Major League Baseball teams have now, after initial skepticism and ridicule, instead pretty much adopted the Moneyball approach, at least to some extent. And again, it's easy to see how this kind of big data approach could be used for far more important things than baseball, like public health. We've recently had a global pandemic which changed our daily lives and upended things in a way that almost nobody would have predicted just a few years ago. And I hope it's obvious to you how being able to track and correlate certain inputs, like vaccination rates or mask wearing or similar, with relevant outcomes like infection rates or hospitalizations or workplace sick leave rates or whatever, can really inform better and more robust approaches to maximize the outcomes we define as good and try to minimize those we define as bad. Now, right there, however, is a clue to how this all plays out in reality. In most cases, unlike with Moneyball, we might not be so clear on how to separate good and bad outcomes. Like with COVID-19, is it more important to decrease infection rates or hospitalization rates or workplace sick leave rates or negative financial impact or what? Different reasonable people can have different reasonable perspectives on this. And this, the inability to agree on what counts as good or bad outcomes, is where the problems really start. You see, in many cases, we have no clear way of defining good or bad. In fact, in many real-world examples of big data, it seems the people in charge simply assume that they know what good is and go with that without ever really questioning it. So, for instance, a well-known example is Amazon's attempt to build an automatic resume sorting algorithm, one that would be able to go through hundreds of job applicant resumes completely automatically and just pick the best ones. Now, how should Amazon define good in this sort of context? Well, what they did was to look at the past 10 years of hiring practices within the company, when it was done the old-fashioned way, painstakingly over hundreds of hours by humans reading through one resume after another and trying to find the best candidate that way. So, to Amazon, the good outcome, in this case, was getting the job in competition with other candidates. And whatever the algorithm would correlate with that, well, presumably it would be a good indicator of who deserved a job most, right? Feeding those hundreds of hours of real work into an algorithm that could learn the tricks and do it in an instant. Well, as it turns out, one of the by far most predictable input variables to determine whether or not somebody was qualified for a job was, wait for it, whether they had a typical male or female name. Yep. It seemed like the data from all those 10 years of human hiring practices revealed that the humans sorting through the resumes had a bias for male applicants over female applicants, even when they were otherwise equally qualified. And the big data analysis, well, all it did was discover this bias and then reinforce it in code. Because Amazon defined good, in this case, as being the one candidate hired from a pool of competing applications, then the big data approach was basically guaranteed to find whatever flaws and weaknesses existed within that system and just deploy them automatically. So yes, it would save time, but it also exposed some serious ethical issues. Now, to their credit, once they realized this, Amazon dumped the automatic approach, which I suppose means they went back to old-fashioned human recruiter bias or something. But either way, whatever they ultimately wound up doing, it highlights a very important limitation with big data, that when it's deployed in relation to some poorly defined notion of good and bad outcomes, then it will likely reinforce existing biases and stereotypes, at least insofar as they already figure within the data being fed into the system. And unlike Moneyball, because there's no new data coming into many of these sorts of systems, data that might challenge overly simplistic notions of good or bad, then the biases and stereotypes will typically persist. To eradicate them, the algorithm developers would need to completely rethink what counts as good and bad, such as years on the job or some sort of quantification of employee value or similar. But as I'm sure you realize, this only kind of kicks the problem further down the road. If women are more likely to go on child leave than men, well, then an outcome variable like years on the job is still likely to value male candidates in a biased manner. And on it goes. But it also gets worse. You see, there are several examples where companies use more of the Moneyball approach, so one where they don't encode biases and stereotypes, but instead constantly improve and refine their algorithms over time to really maximize the good outcomes. The problem? Well, that sometimes these companies define good in a way that clearly disadvantages the people or customers that they deal with. Good in these cases will be something like pure profit, even if this comes at the expense of customers who are misled into buying things that obviously aren't good for them. I think the clearest example of this sort of data-based manipulation of customers is for-profit universities. Oh, and by the way, I'm basing this analysis on the brilliant book Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy by Cathy O'Neil. It's chock full of horrible and shocking examples of big data used in all sorts of nasty ways, and it's written in a very accessible tone, so easy to read for anybody. If you haven't read it already, I highly recommend you take a look. So anyway, for-profit universities. Now these are, as the name suggests, universities that are more interested in making money than in actually educating. They give themselves serious-sounding names like Corinthian colleges and University of Phoenix and so on. But unlike traditional universities and colleges, they spend far more money on marketing and recruitment than they do on actual teaching. And the reasons why are as fascinating as they are horrifying. So basically, the US government has a rule that says that prospective students can't borrow more than 90% of their college or university fees. The idea is that by contributing 10% of their own money, the students will be invested in finishing their degrees. But for the for-profit universities, what they see is that they can max out their fees and expect their students to borrow 90% of those fees from the government, which all goes straight into their pockets. So what they need is they need to target people who can afford the 10%, who will apply for the remaining 90%, and thus help them max their profits. Pretty straightforward, right? How do they do this? Well, there are numerous possible ways, which O'Neil details in her book. But generally, they will target certain sorts of customers, those dreaming of being upwardly mobile but who struggle day to day and who are likely to believe that an education for them or for their children will make a real difference to their future well-being. So the poor and desperate, basically. The same sorts of people who are targeted by predatory high-interest payday lenders or similar. So to do this, the for-profit universities will have entire departments dedicated to finding people in more desperate situations, quickly identify their so-called pain points, so things like low self-esteem or living in a gangland neighborhood or being homeless or whatever, and then vaguely imply to them that a university education at their institution will eliminate their problems. So for-profit universities often target the poorest neighborhoods and individuals with various social or mental health problems. Like one university's recruitment material stated, marketers should target welfare moms with kids, pregnant ladies, recent divorce, low self-esteem, low-income jobs, experienced or recent death, physically, mentally abused, recent incarceration, drug rehabilitation, dead-end jobs, no future. Essentially, the thinking goes, the more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to be convinced that a college degree might be the answer to your problems. Well, maybe I'm too harsh here. Maybe we should give the for-profit universities the benefit of the doubt. I mean, higher education does tend to help people, right? So perhaps they simply fill a niche catering to those who aren't socioeconomically lucky enough to know how to successfully apply to Harvard or Stanford or other Ivy League institutions. Perhaps they're actually the good guys. Of course not. Comparisons have clearly shown that a for-profit university degree is less likely to land you a job than what a public college degree, which you can get at a fraction of the price, would be. In fact, some for-profit universities, like Corinthian colleges, go bankrupt because their alumni sue them in enormous class action lawsuits for things like deceptive advertising, for having given the impression that post-degree employment rates would be much better than what they actually wind up being in reality. But for Corinthian, by the time of their bankruptcy, students there had an outstanding aggregate debt of over 3.5 billion US dollars. Money that had been paid to 90% by the government from taxes on everybody else, and which will now basically never be returned. The leaders of Corinthian pocketed millions before the bankruptcy, and the students who are left with the debts, many of whom will likely never be able to repay them, are the same vulnerable people that the institution's marketers had targeted, encouraging them to take out the enormous student loans in the first place. Now, for me, this is really immoral behavior. I mean, vulnerable people have always been victimized by various scams, and this example is no different in that sense, but it's supercharged by the fact that big data makes it possible to much more efficiently target those precise individuals who are most vulnerable in whatever specific way is most relevant to you. Basically, if the defined good outcome is one of maximizing profits, then trust big data analysis to help you find the people who are most easily suckered into buying whatever you're trying to sell, as well as teaching you how to most effectively sell to them by identifying their pain points or whatever. But maybe you take a different approach. Maybe you're a person who believes that we're all responsible for our own individual choices. And so if a poor, vulnerable person decides to enroll at a for-profit university, then that's ultimately just their own fault. Caveat emptor, you should have been more careful, but you can't blame anybody else for your situation. Now, I don't agree with you. In fact, if this is what you believe, then I think you're completely wrong. But for the sake of argument, let's go with that idea and see where it leads. Okay, let's say hypothetically that we're all entirely individually responsible for every single one of our choices, and falling prey to snake oil and misleading advertisements and so on is nobody's fault but our own. We have to educate ourselves on the risks. We have to read all the relevant background materials. When we sign the document or click the accept button, we have to make sure that we've actually read and understood all the terms and conditions. What then? Well, if that's your perspective, then I would argue that you live in a fantasy world. No matter what they say, nobody, and I mean nobody, actually reads and understands and appreciates all the actual implications of all the terms and conditions we come across in our daily lives. And this is a serious issue for numerous reasons. You see, terms and conditions are, in many cases, legal requirements. So, for instance, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, normally requires that you have to give your informed consent before a company can collect or process your personal information. And in this case, informed consent means that you have to have explicitly agreed to some terms and conditions, the form of which have to follow certain GDPR rules. For most of us, one of the biggest impacts of this is that now, every time we visit a new website, we have to agree to the sorts of cookies that the website is allowed to use to track us. In other words, those annoying pop-up windows that cover the site until you've clicked the accept button. Or the reject button, for that matter, since often that works just as well and won't stop you from being able to use the site. If anything, as a general rule, I recommend you always click the reject button to proactively minimize at least some of the data that's stored about you. Anyway, these GDPR rules impact how websites work all around the world, not just within the EU. Why? Well, because the GDPR says that any website that collects or processes the personal information of somebody within the EU is subject to their rules. And the big US tech conglomerates like Facebook and Apple and so on, well, they don't want to spend the time and effort and cost of setting up completely different interfaces in different parts of the world. So instead, they just implement the GDPR minimum universally. This is important, as it's a fascinating case study of how strict rules in a limited geographical region of the world can still have a significant impact elsewhere. So anyway, we click the accept, or even better, the reject button, and then we can use the website like normal. But how many of you will actually read what you have just accepted? Yes, even if you click reject, you're still accepting some things. So usually it's something like 1 to 2% of the people in any given group. Perhaps slightly higher for data security professionals or data privacy lawyers or similar, but even then, it'll be a vanishingly small minority of the group as a whole that actually reads the T&Cs. And out of these conscientious or perhaps obsessive individuals who claim that they read all the T&Cs for every single website and app and interface and operating system and piece of hardware and whatever else they come across in their daily lives, out of those who claim to read all of this, how many actually understand what they're reading? Because chances are, if you're not a lawyer, then you may have scanned your eyeballs over every single such text, but that doesn't mean that you actually comprehend all of it. And that holds even if you're a professional lawyer. In fact, especially if you're a professional lawyer, well, then you ought to know better than to think that you'd be able to actually appreciate all the potential short and long-term implications of what you're agreeing to. How can I be so sure about this? Well, because we have study after study after study which clearly show that if you take an average adult reading capacity and an average adult reading speed and then use these to estimate the amount of time it would take for a person to get through the full amount of T and Cs we encounter in our daily lives, well, then we're talking several weeks or even months of additional work per year. Basically, put another way, it's not humanly possible to get through all the T and Cs in this way if we expect to be able to do anything like study at university or have a normal job or interact with family and friends. The only practically feasible options, instead, would be either that you live some sort of digital hermit life where you obsessively meditate over all the T and Cs for vast amounts of time and, live off of your trust fund wealth or something for the rest of it. Or alternatively, you move to a cabin in the woods and become an actual hermit, forsaking all digital tools and returning to some sort of pre-industrial self-sufficiency. Yeah, good luck with that. For the rest of us, we're stuck in an impossible situation. We have a vast amount of legally binding informed consent texts to get through and not enough time available in order to ever get through them all, at least if we want to lead reasonably normal lives. So instead, we agree to the collection and processing of our personal information without even thinking about it. Or at least without realizing the actual real-world implications of it, even if we spent a few seconds scanning and reflecting on it. Right, so here's where we come full circle. We've established that it's easy to trick the brain in some ways, not all-out mind control, that's not a real thing. But manipulation of different hardwired reactions? Absolutely. In addition, we've also established that we're all giving our informed consent in ways that turns out not to be the slightest bit informed after all. So really, when we do this, what are we actually agreeing to? Well, let me put it bluntly. We're agreeing to be part of the biggest population psychological experiment in the history of the world. Namely, how much can intimate individual data profiles built up from vast stores of personal information, how much can they be used to affect people's real-world behavior? To buy things, or to vote, or to not vote, or to feel happy, or sad, or angry, or whatever else any data processing company decides to try. And most of us, we just blindly go along for the ride, because that's how the world is structured these days. It's not easy anymore to get by without internet and smartphones and social media and health tracking apps and dating apps and all the other things that millions upon millions of us use on any given day. And trying to limit the ways in which these devices and systems and platforms and apps use our personal information to run their own big data analyses is very, very difficult. So instead, we all tend to just contribute massive amounts of input data, which companies can then link in their analyses to whatever outcomes they themselves define as good. And we continue to do this either in complete ignorance of the risk or in some sort of possible naive hope that maybe the limits of automated manipulation aren't actually that wide. Do we know this for a fact? That automated manipulation is naturally contained at an acceptable level and can't be pushed beyond that no matter how much data we have? Nope, we know no such thing. And if the recent history of social media is anything to go by, I'd argue that we have good reasons to be worried that automated manipulation is far more potent and powerful than what we currently know. Basically, we probably haven't pushed it anywhere near as far as it can go. So we have no real reason to think that manipulating individual users' attention and mood and emotions and so on has reached any sort of peak yet. Where will it all end? Well, that depends on the arms race between the big data tech companies on the one hand and legal restrictions on what they can and can't do on the other. In his book, Why Privacy Matters, law professor Neil Richards argues that our current privacy situation in these early days of big data personal information processing is similar to the health situation during the early days of industrialization. Back then, there were essentially no protections either for factory workers risking life and limb operating huge unsafe machinery or for the general public against the vast amounts of pollution spewed out by the chimneys of ever more and ever bigger industrial factories. Who knows how many lives and livelihoods were destroyed before worker and general public safety regulations caught up and helped put a stop to at least the worst excesses that these revolutionary new technologies introduced. Likewise, for us, in this day and age, the law is struggling to catch up with the new realities of the world of big data, where vast stores of information are aggregated and processed in the interest of increasing or decreasing the likelihood of certain real-world behaviors. Some see this as a fascinating means of improving our societies and lives beyond anything our forebears could have imagined. Others see the unraveling and undermining of democracy and free choice. Who's correct? Well, honestly, that remains to be seen. But at the very least, I think we can all agree that the changes our society is undergoing are big and important, and therefore that they also deserve being treated with a lot of care and some skepticism. Harnessing the strengths without facilitating the weaknesses should be the mantra for any new revolutionary technology, as this surely is. So, where should we go from here? Well, a few final points. First, keep in mind that the concept of privacy is constantly morphing and changing, in flux. It remains important and is not disappearing or becoming irrelevant, but regardless exactly how we define it, we need to both balance it against other values like freedom of speech and national security and so on, as well as working hard to limit it being completely undermined. The sparkly new big data technologies, with all their promise of a better world, come with significant risks, not least to our autonomy. And although these should not be exaggerated, they also patently cannot be ignored. So whatever you ultimately wind up doing, whether you become a data security or privacy expert, or whether your only link to everything I've been talking about is just as an individual citizen with an interest in your own personal information, either way, we should proceed with some caution. Ultimately, I'd say you'll be much happier if you can tell your grandkids that you were on the right side of history. Good luck.